So want to welcome all of our presenters today. So I'll have folks introduce themselves. So perhaps we'll start with, first on my screen, we have Hillary Chappell. Hillary, can you say hi for us and introduce yourself?
Morning, everybody. My name is Hillary Chappell. I come from Calgary, Alberta, which is the traditional land of Treaty 7 and Métis Region number 3. I'm involved with 2 grassroots committees in Calgary, low-income transit and lived experience of homelessness with the Calgary Homeless Foundation. Plus, I'm with 2 national groups, one being the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and the other one is Aging in the Right Place. And I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you. So glad to have you, Hillary. Alex, tell us.
Hi there, my name is Alex Nelson. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm zooming in today from London, Ontario, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, and Chinantan peoples, and I'm grateful to be here today. I am part of the Women's Network as well as the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. I am a person with lived experience of homelessness, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Hillary Marks, please introduce yourself.
Well, good afternoon. I acknowledge that my work is taking place on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. I'm here in Victoria, BC. I'm an experiential woman, she, her pronouns, and I'm very grateful and honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Marie, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Ani bonjour wachiye. Mani McGregor, P1 Put Dishnakas, Anishinaabe Kwendao, Loganing Donjaba Numbo. My name is Marie McGregor, Pitawanakwat. I'm from Loganing on Manitoulin Island, and I'm Anishinaabe Kwe. I'd like to refer to the lived experience of being homeless, and I'd also like to reference that I am a co-chair on a national Indigenous-led research network on housing and homelessness in North America. And I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. And last but not least, Khulud, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Khulud Beg here, joining from Ottawa, which is on the unceded, stolen, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin peoples. I am a researcher, policy advisor with Keepers of the Circle, an Indigenous women's organization from Northeastern Ontario. And I also work as a researcher with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Very excited for this conversation and very excited to join everybody. We've organized the presentation today in 3 themes, and the first theme we're going to be talking about is housing affordability and adequacy, and just going over some of the key findings in this theme. So our first key finding under housing affordability and adequacy talked about how women and gender diverse people, they were experiencing widespread chronic housing affordability issues that were linked to low incomes. And despite this, many are not accessing government benefits that they qualify for. So if you look at like the problems that people are having in accessing a place, not being able to afford a place comes across as one of the most prominent reasons as to why folks are in housing precarity. So 60.2% of the participants noting that they had difficulties affording a place, and affordability being one of their biggest challenges. Other challenges including not being able to afford moving expenses, not being able to afford finding affordable places, but not having them in safe or places that they'd want to live in. And then also local shortages in housing. And all of that kind of speaks to some of the crises that we're seeing in our cities and in different regions across Canada in terms of affordability really becoming out of reach for many people. And this is one of the key issues impacting women and gender diverse people. Other than that, we also heard from folks in terms of health and safety issues that they're experiencing in their housing. So 24% of the people reported non-tenants entering the building, and 23% reporting feeling unsafe in the location that they're in. There were other issues that were mentioned as well. As you can see, an area of reasons for not feeling safe or not feeling secure in their current place of housing were reported, and really a range of reasons which speak to what women and gender diverse people's experiences are when it comes comes to where their housing is located and what kind of housing they're accessing. Thirdly, and finally, we also did a deep dive into what are some strategies that people are using when they're trying to navigate affordability crises. So we know that most of the people who are experiencing affordability crisis are also using prominent subsistence strategies to navigate that sort of crisis. So we saw food banks as being one of those strategies. 30% of the people reporting that they're using food banks, 21% reporting is skipping bills. We had around 8.4% people report that they were engaging in sex work or survival sex to get access to some support or housing support that they need urgently. And then overall, we also heard that on average, people had around $600 left over after paying for their housing. And that really was the amount that they had left over to take care of everything for themselves and their families. So whether that be expenses with children, whether that be expenses with caretaking or medicines or being able to like move around or mobility, all of those different things being mainly being taken care of in that amount. And that really speaks to the deep and chronic affordability crisis being experienced by folks, and that being rooted in the unaffordability of housing across the regions. The second, okay, actually, we'll stop here and we'll go to the question to our lived experts at this point in time. So if we speak to just kind of wanting to open the floor to everybody who's on the call today and speaking to why do you think women and gender diverse people have to rely on so many sources of income, as was stated in the survey, and what do you think are the consequences of it? So when we think about different strategies that women and gender diverse people are using to survive, what are some of the things that come to your mind, and what are some of the things that people are kind of living through when we talk about it? And maybe we can start off with Alex and then go from there.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important question. And I think there's this powerful narrative about homelessness that shapes even the metaphors we use to talk about homelessness, that homelessness just happens to people, that people slip through the cracks. And I think this finding is really indicative that that is not the case. You can be involved in multiple different subsistence strategies and still be experiencing homelessness, because the supports and resources that are available to folks are not enough to meet the needs in the housing landscape that we see around us today. And we also know that the minimum wage in many places is not a living wage and is not able to provide housing, provide the financial resources that people need in order to survive. And I also think it's important that we recognize the gender disruptions in labor due to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and the impact that that has on women and gender diverse people who are working or are unable to work for various reasons and are unable to afford their housing. And so I think that, you know, this unseen labor of filling out forms, busing around from various locations, just trying to make ends meet in whatever way people can. I think there's so much labor that is involved in that we don't acknowledge and don't recognize. And especially for women and gender diverse peoples, often the labor that we put into just surviving is unrecognized. And so we see that that is clearly compounded for people experiencing homelessness and housing issues.
Thank you so much, Alex. That's really awesome. And just wanted to acknowledge everything that you're saying, and also something that's really reflected in the data that we collected. Hillary Chappell, do you want to add something to that question around affordability crises that folks are going through, and what are the consequences?
Well, of course, it's the affordability. Like Alex said, it's the minimum wage being not up to standard, the living wage, nowhere near the living wage. Part of that is so many expenses, especially women who have children, for childcare, transportation. We're fortunate in Calgary, we do have a low income transit pass that we can go anywhere with, but even some of our friends still can't afford that $6 a month. One of the things I'd like to mention though is that a lot of women take a lot of different desk jobs just to survive. And the one that worries me the most is sex work. I think that's a very dangerous way of doing things, but I know some of the ladies don't have a choice, but I can see that endangering them, their children eventually, and a certain amount of Johns out there wouldn't pay them any respect and probably take away parts of their housing or put blackmail on them or stuff like that. So that's one that really concerns me. But there's not a lot of research in that area. I know that. I've researched it myself.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A really great point, Hillary. Like that's a really, really good point. Hillary Marks, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, the whole poverty is the barrier. The having a poverty reduction plan and strategy is a great start. And I know in this province in BC, I worked with the Minister for Poverty Reduction, and you know the money is there. It's not hidden. It's accessible, but there's no will from government to raise people up out of poverty. The government seems to have a very comfortable stance of offloading onto societies and onto nonprofit organizations, and they can't do it on their own. And so it's a shame that instead of creating a system where the government works with the societies and everyone creates affordable 30% rent geared income for women, diverse women, um, we're not going to get very far. The consequences are, emergency services are used. Women don't want to go to welfare offices to ask for $20 for food. It's degrading. It's shameful. It's just women will do whatever they need to do in order to get what they need without attracting more shame and stigma to them if it's possible. So
Yeah.
until the government gets their wills on track and actually does a good poverty reduction, um, we're not going to move very far or fast. And women are going to stay homeless and they're going to stay hidden.
Yeah. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you for that. That's a really powerful point. Looking at a poverty reduction strategy that kind of looks at different aspects of the experience and really addresses them in all at once rather than taking siloed approaches. I think that's a really good point. Marie, in terms of housing affordability.
Uh, um, I think for a lot of women, particularly Indigenous women, that housing affordability is just plain out of reach. And I think one of the challenges is what's happening with the real estate market today is that it's become a very financialized way of doing things. So in other words, people are not buying a home, buying a house for a home, they're buying a house as an investment. So once that starts to happen, then you have costs spiraling out of control, as what is happening here on Manitoulin Island. And I think the other part of the question has to do with perhaps Indigenous women, some Indigenous women don't know what kinds of social supports are available to them and how to access them. So there are bureaucratic machinations in place to either not present that information to them or to make it unwieldy to get to. So that's sort of how I see it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. Both really strong points. I think we've talked about the financialization of housing quite a bit at the network, and I think this is an emerging conversation that I think in coming years is going to be a very powerful tool for us to use and understand what's really happening in the Canadian housing market and why, when you look at G7 countries internationally, Canada is at the top of the income to housing affordability ratio. So it's like one of the most unaffordable housing markets in the world. And why is that happening? And all of you made really good points to like the minimum wage and the livable wage, the kind of strategies that women are engaging in, particularly when it comes to sex work and not having any protections engaging in sex work. And then again, Hillary, I just wanted to collect your point also on the poverty reduction strategy. Very, very important, very, very important. So thank you so much, all of you on this. And we'll move on to our next theme, which is violence and trauma. So just kind of slipping into that. Perfect. So violence and trauma, we have a whole slew of findings that could be categorized under this theme. And the idea really is that homelessness for women and gender diverse people is beginning very early on in life for a majority of women and gender diverse people, and is often followed by chronic chaotic churn of precarious housing and homeless situations. So what we're really looking at is people cycling through different precarious housing situations and different sorts of, again, survival strategies just to kind of stay afloat. And some of the really notable findings that we had under the violence and trauma theme was that we found that around 22.1% of people were first homeless under 16, and then another 22.1% people reporting homelessness between 16 to 19. So really a really critical, significant number of people that became homeless very early on in life and were exposed to really critical and chaotic experiences of trauma and violence very early on in life. And as we have acknowledged already, homelessness being intertwined with experiences of trauma and violence. So, and the other critical piece here as well was that there were certain intersectional aspects of identity that were also significantly linked with being homeless early on. So for example, for folks that identified as Indigenous, also identified with experiencing homelessness early on in life and as youth. And there were some experiences that were reported that were folks experiencing homelessness as early as 11-year-old. So really what we're seeing is homelessness being a part of people's life throughout different stages and ages in their life, and impacting people at different points in their life as they experience housing precarity. So for around of the 500 people that we surveyed, around 43.8% of them reported a 3 or more number of precarious housing situations just in the last year. And this is also very interesting as we think about experiences with the pandemic and how pandemic changed the kind of housing that was available to people, or what was available to people. In the survey, we have noted how folks have reported losing their housing during the pandemic and becoming homeless, but also having to leave their housing because where they were living was very unsafe for them, and they didn't feel particularly safe living there during the pandemic. So these are just, again, some of the things that we saw coming up in the survey that's really interlinked with experiences of trauma and violence, and particularly when experiences are also happening as a global pandemic is going on and people are engaged in emergency responses. I think it's interesting to note again, and we talk about this all the time, that a lot of what we see with women's housing and homelessness situation is the invisibility of those experiences. So many women and gender diverse people are experiencing homelessness that's not necessarily visible or counted as chronic or as, you know, being involved on the streets. Folks are crowd surfing, folks are, living in very inadequate housing that's in major need of repair. Folks are living in their car. Folks are living in abusive situations or with abusive partners just so that they don't lose their housing. And all of these in the survey is what we've counted under the experiences of hidden homelessness. And really, hidden homelessness speaks to the levels of hidden trauma and violence that women and gender diverse people are exposed to just because they don't have basic right to housing met. And I think looking at it from a housing right perspective is so important as well. And Caitlin's probably going to cover that very soon. So, so again, unsurprisingly so, of all the participants that had responded to the survey, 75.2% of them reported experiences with abuse and trauma. And that's a very, very, very significant percentage. And you know, the other significant one that we can probably, the other significant numbers we can probably look at are experiences with the criminal justice system, which is again a traumatizing and violent experience. We can look at actively using substances, and then also knowing how substance use is often not addressed properly in emergency support services. And then 27.8% reporting involvement with child welfare system as a child, and then another 25% reporting child welfare system involvement as an adult. So again, like a whole slew of experiences over lifetime that are deeply interlinked with trauma and violence, and looking at how that also layers with inaccessibility of affordable and adequate housing that can keep women and gender diverse people safe and secure, that can ensure that they have long-term stability. And all of that, again, being really critical to us learning about what women's homelessness or gender diverse homelessness really means, or what it really is. All right, so I'm going to stop over here and call back our lived experts for another question, hoping that they can fill us in with a lot more insights on what we've just talked about. So the question that I have for folks this time around is, what does complex trauma related to homelessness look like for women and gender diverse people? So what really does it mean to have complex trauma, and what does it look like? And then how do we take trauma into consideration when we think about ending homelessness for women and gender diverse people? So, maybe a question being, do you currently think that trauma is being thought about properly when we talk about conversations on housing and homelessness? And just overall, what are your perspectives on it? And this time around, we'll go in the opposite order. So we'll start with Marie this time around.
Okay. So many layered questions, Khulud. I'd like to refer to your chart. I'm in the 0.6% of the population that experienced homelessness between the ages of 60 and 64. So my experience with it happened much later in life, and entirely unpredictable, unplanned. Never, ever, ever in a million years would I ever have imagined being homeless, and yet it happened. And the reason for that is because I had always assumed throughout my whole life that because I was an Indigenous woman registered to Whitefish River First Nation in Northern Ontario, that I would always have a home and a homeland. That turned out not to be the case. And so what happened is because I did not fit within the regulatory regime, provided my own home, my tiny home, that did not fit within their view of how having a home should look. So they did their very best to have me evicted. So I was evicted. And the violence and trauma part occurred when I tried so very hard to stay in my original family home, the one that my late parents gave me. And of course, that wasn't successful. But in the course of trying to stay in that home, a former younger male sibling threatened, stalked, tried to intimidate, catcalled, destroyed garden property, and on and on and on. And none of it was effectively addressed by the police system. And so I'd like to refer to that experience, the violence and trauma, as what I went through. And I was thinking, okay, so if this has happened to me, how many times has it happened to other people? And how do we work to prevent that? So I just wanted to refer to that as my part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie, for sharing your experience and kind of shedding light again on the kind of like safety risks and security risks that women are exposed to once they lose their housing. Losing housing is that pathway to violence for women, because housing is where people feel safe or where they can be secure. So such a critical point. Thank you so much, Marie. Hillary Marks.
Hi, yeah, trauma. What a big conversation you can have around trauma. I've got a few points around it. I mean, trauma in regards to homelessness and sheltering women at the top of the grid, you could say housing lists. There's no face to these pieces of paper. There's just a name and information, and people are housed together in these precarious homeless shelters. I don't think they're the best of what could be done. And so the women are already traumatized from issues that have happened throughout their life, and then thrown into a pot of mesh that there's no trauma-informed care. There's no excuse me, there's no person-centered care. There's nothing to do with a person's personal trauma. And it's kind of like, get over it. You can fix this yourself, figure it out. Um, you know, people with addictions have to figure out whether or not they're going to self-medicate to keep pushing down that trauma. And then you have people that are judging homeless women as people with addictions, and they're just lazy and they can't figure things out. And people really don't get the whole ground of trauma and how it affects women differently, and it affects each woman differently. There's no I don't think there's any template really for how trauma affects. And I think that something should be changed in regards to how women are housed, how the housing shelters, emergency shelters, if it weren't for COVID, we would still be in the same place we were 3 years ago. We wouldn't probably be having this conversation because COVID has exposed so much. So I think that housing for women should be built by women. I think it should be engineered by women. I think the tables have to have more women at them that are discussing housing. And I think that trauma, there needs to be more done in regards to women's homelessness and trauma, because it's just too, it's not a shallow conversation, and there's just way too much to it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hillary. I think you've hit the nail on the head with so many things that you said. Absolutely, there's no one size fit all approach. And if there's anything that we've learned in the survey and the work that we continue doing, it's that there is no one size fit all approach. People are going through very diverse and complex experiences, and to be led by lived expertise is to acknowledge that we need unique solutions, we need many solutions, and we need different solutions led by different groups of women that are very particular to where they are at and what their communities look like and what their communities want. So I just wanted to acknowledge everything you said. It's super powerful and important. I'll move on to Hillary Chappell next.
I think I'd like to share about my own trauma. I went from a bad marriage of a controlling woman who threw things at me, hit me once, and threw a lot of cutlery and dishes and stuff and wouldn't clean it up, to when we finally separated, which was a good thing, but I had no money. I didn't know at the time that I couldn't keep a job because I was in so much pain, and I had a mental breakdown during that period. I went to Edmonton from Calgary, and I went to a few different places, and all of it was trauma related, because a lot of the people, even one of the friends I was with, you know, she had her own family to deal with, and I had to sleep on a concrete floor. I had a cot there sometimes. I had my totes all around me, and I've slept many times on people who just didn't understand my situation. And you know what, to be honest, either did I. I only knew about the trauma I felt, which when I got into a shelter and I was told by a case manager. And then once I got out of homelessness, I started having the worst PTSD I could imagine. And that's the way it triggered for me. And the PTSD was always about being abandoned by my family. Mom and dad weren't alive, but my sister and my brother, nieces and nephews, not that they really did, they just couldn't cope anymore. I understand that now. But even friends, they couldn't help me that much anymore. They had their own families. But at that time, the feeling of abandonment lasted for about 2 or 3 years. I'm fine now, but that trauma still occasionally rears its ugly head. And if I hear of somebody who's been left by their family, I get a trigger. So that's all I need to say about that.
Thank you for sharing that, Hillary. And it's just, I think, one of the things that we always think about when we're doing our work is about how housing, having stable housing also is healing for people. So like, people need to feel safe to address their traumas and to heal from their traumas. And if you don't put people in safe and secure housing, you're taking away that opportunity from them to heal themselves and to heal their families and their communities, you know? So this is, again, like, it's so interlinked with so many different and deep experiences that people have. And I just really, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And with that, I'll go to Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I think everyone who's spoken has shared an important piece of themselves and of this conversation, because trauma is a very complicated topic, and I think that it's not a very well understood one. I am in my PhD, and one of the topics I study is trauma. But I was drawn to the topic before I came to understand myself as someone who had experienced trauma. And actually, I first started to think of myself and my life in the context of trauma after attending my first Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness conference. I had studied homelessness and I had experienced homelessness, but I didn't really think about my experiences in terms of trauma, because I didn't think I had always heard about trauma as being rooted in catastrophic events. And I've certainly experienced some of those, but also there's this, you can experience trauma as this unfolding everyday experience, especially living with violence and oppression and exploitation. And I think that when we're talking about trauma and trauma-informed responses, we need to start to understand that trauma doesn't look the same for everyone, and especially from folks from different communities. As a queer person, understanding the trauma embedded in moving through the world as a queer person, it's something that I think there's not a lot of room or flexibility in our structures to understand what that experience is like. And for me, you know, that my trauma manifests in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's very physical, like shaking or freezing or being unable to speak. And other times it's in the ways that I have trouble setting personal boundaries or communicating my needs with people in my life, because growing up experiencing homelessness and being taken into foster care is very challenging to learn how to build those healthy boundaries with people in my life, because forming unsafe attachments was how I survived. And I think I've brought a lot of those things, those unhealthy coping mechanisms and survival strategies into my adult life, especially in relationships that I've had since. And I think that, you know, that is one of the ways that trauma kind of exists past a moment and moves into the future with you. It stays with you. And so when we're talking about rights and we're talking about justice, we need to be asking those questions of how do we show up for all members of our community? How do we bring them back into our community and center people who've experienced intersecting and interlocking forms of trauma that's rooted in historical oppression, that's rooted in ongoing oppression, because those are parts of the conversation as well. And I think that, you know, especially for women and gender diverse peoples, there are so many different ways that trauma impacts your life that it's really, you know, it's a complicated topic to approach. But I think, you know, we've all shared different ways of experiencing and relating to trauma.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Alex. And before I just kind of pass it on to Caitlin, who will take us through the rest of the presentation, I just wanted to make a note of what you said, which is really important, that, you know, trauma is personal and interpersonal, but trauma is also from like oppression, from like ongoing systems and system failures, from like, you know, folks that are from indigenous communities experiencing intergenerational trauma, colonial oppression, from like folks who are from immigrant and refugee communities experiencing that trauma of separation or belonging to war-torn places, and then coming to Canada and experiencing a whole new war on a different front in terms of trying to find safety and security for their families. So they're the larger frameworks of oppression existing in terms of society and systemic and structural oppressions, and then also trauma that we experience interpersonally as we're trying to live and survive. And I think both of those form very complex experiences that need to be acknowledged when we're talking about housing and homelessness, but then also need to be consistently considered as we try to build solutions and work towards solutions. So with that, thank you so much for everything that all of you have said. I'm going to pass it on to Caitlin to take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Khulud. I just have to say, and I'm sure everyone who's seeing this feels the same as me, like I feel so honored to be part of this conversation with all of you, the kind of trust that you've placed in all of us for sharing your experience and your expertise and your insights. I feel so humbled to be part of this conversation. So thank you all so much. We had so much planned for this presentation. This conversation has been so rich that I think we're only going to be able to kind of go through one more of the key findings and hear your insights on that. You know, as we were designing this survey, and our work at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network has really been thinking about, okay, how do we understand these issues as human rights issues? So as all of you know, I imagine we have new federal legislation, the National Housing Strategy Act, that recognizes for the first time in Canada that housing is a human right. So we're on this potential precipice of saying, okay, what does this actually mean concretely for women, girls, and gender diverse people in Canada? How can we ensure that it's a mechanism for a more just future that really, you know, it makes it possible for us to address many of the challenges that we are seeing in the research that we've done and that my colleagues have spoken to here. So I'll just speak to one finding that was, I think, really important, and I think we can draw kind of a human rights analysis too. So we did something interesting. In the survey, we asked folks, okay, tell us about the last time that you lost your housing. What was the reason? And we listed many, many reasons. There was, I think, over 20 reasons. It could be because of an eviction, because of a health crisis, because of loss of a job, because of violence, change in family composition. So we gave folks many, many reasons. And what we found is that the top reason that women and gender diverse folks lose their housing is because of a breakup. And if you see on the graph here, you'll see that almost half of participants in this survey, that was the reason they lost their housing most recently. And this is across age, across demographic groups, across regions. This is absolutely a very gendered experience, is what this data suggests. And I think something I've been talking about and thinking about with this survey is I think it shows us that women and gender diverse folks, this is a group whose housing really depends on whether they remain in some kind of personal or sexual or romantic relationship with someone else. And that this, by a whole range of standards, is a human rights violation. So the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing has spoken really beautifully about women's human rights and independence really being critically related to her ability to own housing, to dispose of property, and to have control over one's own housing. And what we're seeing is actually kind of a hidden crisis of women and gender diverse folks who are experiencing kind of informal evictions into homelessness because, you know, they're not able, because there's a rupture in a relationship. So this was really important, really interesting, and I'd love to turn to our experts here to kind of get your thoughts on it, and kind of, you know, let us know what resonates for you. How do we make sense of this? So maybe I'll go to, yeah, we're going to reverse the order here. So maybe I'll start with you, Alex, and hear your thoughts on this. What does this mean, do you think?
Yeah, I really just want to reiterate Khulud's point about how trauma especially is both interpersonal and structural. And I think we see that in this finding that so many people, women and gender diverse people experiencing homelessness, have experienced homelessness due to a breakup or due to the breakdown of the relationship that they're in. And this is something I experienced myself, although I would never have thought about it in those terms. I was actually talking to one of my friends who has also experienced homelessness, and they were sharing their experiences. And they described an experience of homelessness resulting from a breakup. And I was finally able to put words to something that I just didn't have the language to talk about previously. And especially given that this was in my adult life, and I talk a lot about my experiences of youth homelessness, but less so about the experiences that are closer to me in terms of time from when I've been an adult. And just coming to understand myself in these findings, and to recognize that, yeah, this impacts so many people that I personally know, including myself. That, you know, housing is deeply unaffordable, and oftentimes trying to afford housing on your own, especially if you live somewhere where the cost of housing is significantly higher, it's almost impossible. So you're forced into a situation where you have to rely on someone else in order to stay in your housing. And even though I'm in a good relationship now, and I live with my partner, and we're both paying for our housing, I recognize that if we were to break up, I would have very limited options. And it's really scary to live with that knowledge and that understanding that I'm dependent on someone else for my survival. And I think when we also talk about trauma, that's something that always stays with you, is that knowledge of yourself as precarious, and how that expands across a lifetime. But I think that this is an extremely important finding, and one that reframes everything we know when we talk about women and gender diverse people's experiences of homelessness and how they differ from normative understandings of homelessness.
I deeply, deeply agree. I think this is kind of a transformative finding, and I love the connections you made with how this is kind of inextricably linked to trauma, and kind of this the trauma that follows us. Like, I loved what you said earlier, Alex, that trauma is not just a moment, it follows you through your life, it echoes through your life. And I think this is absolutely true. And we think about the kind of housing precarity that many women and gender diverse folks are living through, kind of in some cases having to remain in relationships that maybe aren't great for them, or they don't want to be in part because of the affordability issues that you pointed to. So brilliant. Thank you so much. And Hillary Chappell, we're going to go to you next for your thoughts.
Well, trauma is definitely involved with everything that I've gone through personally, except for my recent relationship. But I went through trauma in the places I lived. I didn't, but the thing is, until I got to a shelter finally at the end of my homelessness, I was part of the hidden homeless. I didn't know what trauma was. Then I took a course on it and realized how much I had been through it, with all the things, with the mental health, the abuse from my first wife, to going from house to house to house. I went to 12 different places, ending in the shelter in a 1.5 year period. So that's traumatic in itself. A lot of it was affordability. A lot of it was because I didn't clean the house up good enough. A lot of it's because I was sleeping on the floor. One of the reasons in the house that I was actually paying rent for, that I couldn't afford anymore because I had to go to a money mart to pay for it, as I had to and give up, and it had severe bed bugs for 1 year. We couldn't get rid of the bed bugs. It was disgusting. And I got bitten and lost half of my furniture. But when I finally got to Calgary, I realized how fortunate I am, because while I was in the shelter for 1.5 years, just about 1.5 years, I met someone online and very quickly fell in love. She's a wonderful woman. She owns her own house. And after 6 months of hanging out and dating and getting to know her and her daughter, she asked me to live with her. And for 2 years after that, I had that PTSD, wondering what would happen if she ever threw me out. But she wasn't. It's steady. We're now married. happily married, and I've never felt secure in my whole life, actually. So I consider myself every single day how fortunate I am from the past experiences of trauma I've been through to the now where I have a very happy, peaceful, very peaceful life. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Hillary. And I mean, I think I share with all of my colleagues here in just celebrating you and this love in your life. And I mean, I think you also point to the importance of home ownership. And this is something, Hillary Marks, you also said, like the importance of actually women being at the table in terms of designing homes, owning homes, engineering homes. And the fact that you, Hillary Chappell, have a partner who owns her own home, and the kind of stability that that's been able to bring into both of your lives is really wonderful. And I think obviously we want that for all women and gender diverse folks across the country. Yeah. And Hillary Marks, can I turn to you now for your thoughts?
Sure. Well, 1982 was the beginning of my homeless years, and I was in a really severe, abusive, physical, mental, spiritual relationship for about 15 years, and found myself sleeping on floors. Can't remember half of the places I ended up. But it was a lot of midnight moves. It was a lot of moving. It was a lot of being dependent on somebody else for housing. And with PTSD and trauma, that is so stressful, and it is just such, I mean, homelessness is a 24-hour-a-day job. It's not something that you do for half an hour out of your day. It's you have to, you're on a schedule. Like, you have to figure out where you're going to sleep. The minute you wake up in the morning is you have to figure out where you're going to sleep that night. It's a continuous thing, and it's just so stressful. And at this point in my life, I'm very grateful to be housed. I've been in rent geared income housing for 26 years. I don't plan on leaving housing. I am not even thinking about getting in a relationship with anyone because I'm dependent on myself. As Alex and Hillary have said, it's hard when you're dependent on someone else, and it just creates so much stress in your body. It's unbelievable. And now, the way I'm living, I feel so grateful that I have a home that I lock the door and I go out and I know that everything is going to remain the same when I turn that key and come back in here. And nobody comes here. It's my house. It's my safe sanctuary. And so it's unfortunate that I have a feeling of not wanting to be in a relationship with someone because of housing. But if the person has their own house, as Hillary said, and they're stable, then maybe a relationship can form. But there's no, I will never give up my housing because I don't want my daughter. I don't want to be dependent on her. I don't want to be dependent on a system that is severely broken. I want to be dependent on myself. And so it's human rights is our right to have housing, and somehow we got to get there a lot quicker and a lot faster. And it's interesting to see how we all have different aspects of our homelessness and where we stand at this point in time in the 21st century. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And I know we've talked before about kind of your experiences in the 80s and feeling like there isn't a tremendous difference between, you know, experiences of homelessness then and where we're at now. And I just love what you articulated about, you know, closing your door, locking the door, leaving, and then being able to come back and for it to remain the same, that kind of control. And how critical that is to feeling safe, to feeling secure, and, you know, the kind of central importance that plays in all of our lives. So that was just beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Marie, I'd love to turn to you for your thoughts and kind of to close out our session today. Yeah.
Oh, I
Sorry.
think you're muted, Marie. Just you're muted. So if you can just unmute yourself, thank you.
Thanks for reminding me. So the question was, what caused the homelessness? And there was a reference to the findings of the survey suggesting that a breakup was a prime reason among a high percentage of respondents. In my case, it didn't happen that way. And the cause of my homelessness was that the community and the band council did not recognize that my parents had full rightful legal authority according to indigenous allodial land title to gift home and land. And I understood it and accepted it. My parents understood it and accepted it. They were well within their authority to be able to give land and home to whomever in their family they wished. So they did that. But the parties that did not understand were the band council, the community, and the former male younger sibling that worked to have me evicted from my home. And there is a misunderstanding that Indian reserves in Canada are owned by Indians. They're not. Indian reserves in Canada, full legal title is held by the Crown, in other words, the federal government. So anyone that lives on an Indian reserve does not own the land unless you're exercising indigenous allodial land title and practicing traditional custom by passing land on to family members or to whomever you wish. So effectively, if you're on the reserve and you have a certificate of possession, which is a form of quasi-ownership, it is not ownership. All it is the federal government's permission to use and occupy. And that is a huge misunderstanding. So I went through the whole experience of being evicted from the family home that my parents gave me to providing for my own tiny home on unused reserve land, in which the band council also misunderstood that. They misunderstood that I have a human right to a home. I have a human right to live on my own ancestral homeland, and they disregarded it, and they worked actively to have me evicted, not just once, but twice. Once from the original family home, the second time from Whitefish River First Nation altogether. So what I have done with that, when you get lemons, you make lemonade. I've learned to do two things. One is to explain to whoever and whenever and however I can what indigenous allodial land title is. Effectively, we still own the land, because if the treaties have not been enforced, if the purchases have not been made properly, then our lands have been stolen from us. The second mission that I have is, as Hilary Marks suggested, that women should be able to build our own homes, we should be able to engineer our own homes, and we should be able to have those homes on our own indigenous allodial land title lands. So I just wanted to offer that as the place that I'm coming from, and that is what I've learned from my experience. And so I'm putting it out there, and I hope for the very best for everyone who can work towards achieving these goals. Thanks.